You know, when you picture justice, you probably think of that blindfolded woman holding a set of scales, right? The symbol of total impartiality. But what if the law itself, the system she represents, isn't as neutral as we've been led to believe? Well, that is the huge, explosive question right at the heart of feminist jurisprudence. And it's a fascinating, complex, and really important internal debate that we're about to dive into. All right, so here's our game plan for this explainer. We're going to start with that core question: is justice gendered? Then we'll look at two major competing strategies, the liberal and the radical views. After that, we'll listen for a totally different voice with something called the ethic of care. And finally, we'll see why this whole conversation is, frankly, more urgent right now than ever.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. Before we can really get into the different arguments, we have to understand the fundamental challenge, the one big question that kind of unites all of these different schools of thought. It really all boils down to this. We're all taught that the law is this objective, universal, impartial thing. But feminist legal thinkers came along and asked, hang on, is that really true? Or does the law itself have a hidden point of view?
So, that gets us to our main idea here. Feminist jurisprudence isn't just one single concept. It's an entire field of study. You can think of it as a special lens that you use to look at the law. And when you look through it, you start to see how the law might not just be a neutral referee, but actually an active player in shaping our ideas about gender, and a lot of the time, in keeping inequality in place. Okay, so the one thing pretty much all these thinkers agree on is this. The law, as we know it, was historically written and interpreted almost exclusively by men. And because of that, it naturally reflects a masculine perspective. So the goal becomes this two-step process. First, you have to deconstruct the law, basically take it apart to see where it's failing. And then second, you try to reconstruct it. You imagine how we can rebuild it so that it's truly inclusive and delivers equality for everyone. And this quote from legal scholar Robin West just hits the nail on the head. It perfectly illustrates what's at stake. She points out that because the law was built on this male standard, a lot of the harms that primarily affect women, whether that's at home, at work, wherever, they just aren't even seen as legal issues. They kind of fall through the cracks, completely outside of what the law is designed to fix. So, if the law's got a problem, how do you fix it? Well, the first major camp we're going to look at, liberal feminism, basically argues that the system itself is pretty sound. It just needs to actually live up to its own promises. Basically, the liberal strategy is all about reform. It says, look, the core principles of law, justice, freedom, all that stuff, they're good. The problem is they just haven't been applied equally to women. So the fight becomes about getting equal access. You use the existing legal tools, the courts, the legislatures, to fight for things like equal pay, equal opportunities, and the right for women to make their own choices. But of course, this approach gets some pretty sharp pushback, often from other feminists. They ask, does fighting for equality on male terms just force women to act more like men to succeed? And what about the private sphere? You know, the home, where the law has historically refused to get involved, but where so much inequality really takes root. And here's the biggest question. What if the system isn't just a little flawed? What if it's biased to its very core? And that last question, what if this system itself is the problem, leads us directly to the second and way more revolutionary school of thought, the radical feminist critique. Wow. Okay, let that sink in for a second. This is the core claim of radical feminism, and it is a bombshell. The argument here is that the very idea of legal neutrality, the calm, detached, impartial judge, isn't some universal concept. It's a masculine one. So the problem isn't that the law is failing to be objective. The problem is that objectivity itself is a male construct. So you can see, for radical feminists, the goal isn't just tweaking the system. It's a total revolution. The target isn't just a few unequal laws. It's the entire social structure of patriarchy, the system of male domination. Their method is to expose how the law doesn't just fail women, it actively creates and reinforces their subordination, especially when it comes to issues of power and sexuality. Now, this is where you can really see the split, clear as day. Liberal feminists see a fundamentally good system that's just made some mistakes and needs correcting. Radical feminists see a fundamentally corrupt system that needs to be completely dismantled. One side says, the system is broken, let's fix it. The other says, the system is the problem, let's tear it down. This is the central fault line in the entire debate.
Now, the radical view doesn't get a free pass either. It has its own critics. Probably the biggest charge is something called essentialism, the idea that it kind of lumps all women together into one single group, as if they all have the exact same experience, which ignores huge differences in race, class, and culture. Others argue that by focusing so heavily on oppression, it can accidentally frame women only as victims, and that it can sometimes shut down debate by claiming that any woman who disagrees with it just has false consciousness.
Okay, so we've got these two big camps. One says work within the system, the other says tear it down. But then a third perspective came along and said, hey, maybe you're both asking the wrong question. So to get this, let's look at a famous ethical puzzle that the psychologist Carol Gilligan used. It's called the Heinz Dilemma. When she posed this question to kids, she noticed that boys and girls often came at it from different angles. Boys tended to see it as a conflict of rules, the rule against stealing versus the abstract right to life. But the girls often tried to find a different kind of solution, one that preserved the relationships. They'd ask questions like, couldn't he talk to the pharmacist? Maybe work out a payment plan? And what Gilligan argued was that this showed two totally different ways of thinking, like two different moral operating systems. The law, she said, is built almost entirely on the ethic of justice. It's detached, abstract, and focused on rights, but it has totally ignored or devalued the ethic of care, which is all about context, relationships, and finding supportive solutions. The point isn't that one is better than the other, but that a truly just legal system needs to value both. Okay, I know what you might be thinking. This all sounds super academic, right? Like something you'd argue about in a university classroom. But the thing is, these exact debates are exploding in our headlines and in our courtrooms right now. I mean, just think about it. The #MeToo movement was all about bringing to light harms the legal system had historically dismissed or ignored. The whole debate over abortion rights is a direct clash between abstract legal rules and women's real, concrete life experiences. You see reports about deep-seated misogyny in police forces, or the fact that the gender pay gap just won't go away. All of this shows that the question of whether the law really serves everyone is far, far from settled. And this stuff isn't just theory or protest, it's actually being put into practice in some really cool ways. The Feminist Judgments Project is a perfect example. Legal scholars take real, actual court cases that have already been decided. Then they rewrite the judge's decision, but they do it using one of the feminist legal theories we've been talking about. It's an incredible way to show, not just tell, how a totally different perspective could lead to a totally different and maybe more just outcome. And all of this leads us to one last, really provocative question posed by the scholar Janet Halley. With all these competing theories, all these internal fights, has the whole project gotten a bit stuck? Should we, as she kind of cheekily suggests, take a break from feminism? Now, hold on, her point isn't to just give up the fight. It's really a call for pragmatism. She's saying, instead of trying to find one single grand theory of feminism that explains absolutely everything, maybe activists and thinkers should see these different approaches, liberal, radical, the ethic of care, as different tools in a toolbox. You wouldn't use a hammer for every single job, right? You pick the tool that works for the specific problem you're trying to solve. But, and this is the big but we're left with, what are the risks of that? In a world where the injustices are so real and so current, what happens if you step back from a unified collective movement? Can a collection of different tools ever have the same force as a single, focused cause? The great debate, as you can see, is definitely not over.